Hello, my name is Jim. This is my podcast, The Bloody Vegans. You're very welcome to it. Each week I'll be travelling ever deeper into the world of veganism, discovering along the way a multitude of viewpoints from the political and ethical to the practical. I'll be doing this through a series of conversations, each aiming to further illuminate my understanding and hopefully yours of all things plant-centric, and this week is no different. This week, I'm going to be chatting with Carol J. Adams. Carol is a feminist vegan advocate, activist, independent scholar, and author of an absolute treasure trove of books, including her truly groundbreaking The Sexual Politics of Meat, a feminist vegetarian critical theory, which is actually 30 years old this year. So Carol and I talk about a whole range of subjects, from the upcoming US general election, the impact of social media on feminism and intersectionality, and its connection, all of its connection with veganism. So without further ado, here's a conversation between me and Carol J. Adams. First of all, Carol, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's amazing having you on, and just a huge congratulations on the 30th anniversary of Sexual Politics of Meat. Just a seminal work and so influential, and sadly as relevant today as it was when it was first published. How would you, for those who haven't necessarily come across the book yet, how would you describe the book and those who are perhaps new to your work?
Well, thanks, Jim. And yes, 30 years. It's sort of incredible that the book's been out for 30 years and still speaks to the current conditions of our world. I guess I'm making three main points in the book, or I guess I'll have to say four. The first is that the sexual politics of meat is referring to the idea that men need meat, men are supposed to eat meat, real men eat meat, all of those sort of tropes or slogans that we can experience or run into through social media, through advertisements, through meat advertisements, but not just meat advertisements, which is sort of fascinating. And I know we'll get back later to how that's changed, so I'll just talk about how the book was trying to intervene in pointing that out, and how vegetables then were denigrated and associated with women. So, it's fine for women to eat a salad, but why would men want a salad? All of those stereotypes which participate in a gender binary that we know is itself faulty. And so the second thing is that I identified that animals are absent reference in meat eating and dairy and egg production. And what I meant by that is that animals disappear as unique beings who are alive and make decisions and have relationships, to becoming objects and objectified. No name, they're killed, and the food that is taken from their corpses is renamed. So the animal who exists or enables meat eating and dairy and eggs to exist disappears from conscious reference. And this is what makes meat eaters comfortable to have absent reference in their lives, and people who eat the products of cows and chickens. And this is also what makes them uncomfortable when they're interacting with vegans, because what we do by not eating the dead animal or the milk, mammalian milk or eggs, is remind them that they have a choice, and that we see a relationship with the other animals who've disappeared so that they can, the meat eaters and non-vegans, can have their meals. The third thing I said was that women also are absent reference in a patriarchal culture, so that women disappear as subjects of our own lives and become objects in a consumer patriarchal culture, and that then women and animals become these sort of interchangeable absent reference. And that's discussing not just ideas about animals as sexualized beings in advertisements. You can find them, walking around London, in Manchester. There are a variety of examples from England and Scotland that I've been sent. But it's also functioning in the way women are talked about as pieces of meat, so that the referent point for animals who are sexualized are objectified women, and the referent point for women who are called cow or chicken or shown as cut up as a piece of, as like a diagram of a dead animal, is the animal, so that there's this constant reinforcement of disempowerment by reference to another disempowered being. And the fourth thing I did in the book was show the benefits of bringing this sort of political understanding about women and animals to looking at history and literature. So, for instance, why was Frankenstein's monster a vegetarian? Who were the vegetarians in our past? How did those vegetarians, because the word vegan wasn't coined till the 1940s, how did they see themselves in relationships to other radical causes? Finally, I think what the book did 30 years ago is it provided vegans and animal activists a source that said, yes, your intuition that what you are doing here is connected to other social justice movements is correct. And here is why.
And also incredibly relevant today. Like, as you go through the subjects there, I think, particularly when I think about that last one about the connection with social justice movements, I often don't necessarily see that connection being made, and it feels like your work here is so relevant today. And I just wondered on your viewpoint, as it feels like, to my mind anyway, that there's some progressive steps made, and then that there's been perhaps a real lurch away from those progressive steps in the last few years, whether it be the rise of Trumpism, or I think about the Tory party over here in the UK. And it kind of, to me, seems like almost an overt kind of patriarchy, kind of in backlash, if you like. And I suppose the optimistic view would be that it'd be the last throes of that, trying to reassert itself. But I'd love to get your viewpoint on where you think it's sort of the current climate sits in relation. Do you feel like it is the final throes, or whether actually the battle is still very much being waged as it was 30 years ago?
I think that yes, any advance brings back or results in retrenchment, regressive politics. Certainly, the white supremacist beliefs of Trump and his followers was a response to having our first African-American president. We've seen that with feminism, retrograde beliefs coming back through wave after wave of feminism, that it's every advance has to be reacted against, repressed. One of the interesting things that is noted is, for instance, that when you find nostalgia in a culture, that nostalgia has often been triggered by the change in women's roles. So, for instance, lots of voters in 2016 felt the 1950s were a better time. I'm sorry, the 2016 presidential election here. Those voting for Trump felt that the 1950s were a better time than now. And so the nostalgia for that time is telling us something, because what were the 1950s? For us in the United States, it was a time of Jim Crow, which is, was the United States version of apartheid. It was a time when women could not get credit cards, could not get bank loans, weren't supposed to have names on a checking account, were discriminated against at work. There was a huge movement, homophobic movement against employing gays at the federal level. So whenever you encounter nostalgia, and what summarizes nostalgia more than a traditional meat dinner? Roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, or, hamburgers, those all become, the aura for them is this nostalgic remembrance of when that was an undisturbed act. And so, whether we know it or not, our veganism is making a political statement now that's very threatening. And one of the other things we see is this rise, not just of white supremacy, but of white Nazis. Speaking about the United States, where what we know now is that the biggest threat, terrorist threat in the United States, is white supremacists. And white supremacists themselves have been using meat and dairy as symbols of part of what they represent. So, for instance, we know that the majority of the world has lactose intolerance. That is, they lack the enzyme that helps you digest mammalian milk. And the people who are most easily digest mammalian milk are whites from Europe, European descendants of Northern Europeans. And so drinking cow's milk becomes a symbol for the Nazis of the right wing right now. So I know I've gone a little further than what you were asking. We are in the midst of an attempt to roll back the advances that have occurred for many oppressed groups. We are trying to end xenophobia during a time when xenophobia is so strong. We're trying to end white supremacy during a time that, we're having to say Black Lives Matter in the United States. We're trying to end misogyny during a time when women's bodies become still a political football, as they call it. Just yesterday, we learned that women being held in these, what some are calling concentration camps, because they have no rights. They've been forced to have hysterectomies. So all of these things that control the bodies of oppressed people are happening right now. And so whatever advances we had aren't just undercut by the oppression of the individual groups that are being affected, but by the corollary, which is the deprivation of democratic rights to be able to use democracy as a remedy against oppression. And I feel that very strongly right now, because we're in the middle of another presidential election where there's a fear that Trump will win, not through the votes, but through depriving people of the right to vote and benefiting from the interference of foreign governments. Anyway, that's a political issue for vegans, because retrograde politics hangs its hat on meat and dairy. It's part of that identity.
Yeah, that absolutely. I think it is, and that piece around the nostalgia. I think absolutely this, whether it's make America great again, or that kind of terminology, absolutely harks back to a time when repression was even more overt than it is today. And I suppose in context of the election, and just sort of as we're on the subject, I'd love to get your view on. Do you feel that the the sort of the election that's upcoming is incredibly, obviously, critical in the removal of, say, Trump from office. However, I suppose there's a concern in my mind that the choice here is not necessarily one of systemic change versus Trumpism, but kind of two sides of the same coin. And are we in danger, even if there is a sort of a democratic win in this election, of thinking, well, that's kind of job done? I mean, you could argue in a way that Obama kind of caused a complacency in sort of, what we'd call the left, if you like. Do you think that that the election has the power to cause that complacency if it goes the other way? Or do you think actually there's some real traction in some of these social justice movements now that we absolutely need to hang on to?
I don't think the left was complacent with Obama. The left was unhappy with Obama. I mean, Obama got the health care passed, but there were international relationships that were very disturbing. And this was the problem that happened in 2016, was that the left didn't see Hillary as some people on the left didn't see Hillary as being able to deliver on the kinds of goals they had. But right now, I mean, we're talking about whether Trump is going to stack our federal judiciary with regressive politicians long after Republicans are so outnumbered in the country that we'll be stuck with decisions that are way out of touch with where the U.S. citizens are. But because they're appointed for life, they're going to protect still the 1% in a variety of ways. So this election is definitely not. They are different sides of the coin. You have someone who disparages science. If we had only had someone who's just stepped up in February and said, "Wear a damn mask," and where's the empathy? I mean, just going back to why we're concerned about animals, many of us do that because there's empathy. We are empathetic people. But we're living in a world in which empathy is ridiculed. So having empathy, if we had empathy, we would recognize that wearing a mask is the simplest thing we could do as neighbors. Just as, being vegan is a part of being a neighbor to others, neighbor to the animals who are being killed, a neighbor to the people who live in the South, as it's called, who are more likely to be affected by climate change. So right now, I mean, we know that the United States has got, hurricanes on the right side of us and wildfires on the left, all signs of climate change. But these issues that are really life or death are being voted on this year. We can't wait 4 more years to have a climate policy, however weak it is. And one of the things I did in this book called Protest Kitchen was we tried to say, look, no matter where your country is, like United States or wherever, in terms of the Paris Accords, you yourself are either participating in stopping climate change or you yourself are withdrawing from those accords, depending upon what you're eating and who you're eating. So yes, let's have change at the national level and international level, but recognize that there's something you yourself could be doing every day about where we are.
100%. And like you say, that empathy, I'd like to think within the vegan community is probably more pronounced, by many people's, decision to become vegan in the first place. I'd like to get your view on the kind of rise of social media culture, if you like, and whether you feel, because I think in many ways, certainly, and I've not been vegan anywhere near as long as yourself, like 3.5 years for me. and social media, as well as, you know, the various documentaries that have been made in the last kind of sort of 3 to 5 years or so, have played a huge part, certainly in my decision making, my understanding perhaps of some of the issues, particularly around climate change, which was one of the initial seeds of inspiration for me. But do you see that social media has a kind of potential for harm to the vegan community, or do you think it is all, you know, exclusively positive as a means to spread a message?
I think it's mixed. Let's talk about what's positive. If I want to make an eggplant ricotta dish out of my tofu ricotta, I could probably have 5 vegan eggplant ricottas at the touch of my Googling fingers. Certainly recipes, people blogging about recipes. I mean, and of course, because blogs aren't limited, like if I were doing an article for a print newspaper, we often learn a lot more than we need to know before we ever get to the recipe. But so, you know, whether social media brings about a sort of logorrhea, you know, talking too much is a question. And social media helps spread information, certainly, and that's positive. But there's a woman, a feminist, wrote a book back in the 1980s called The Pornography of Representation. And she said, culture is patriarchy's mirror. You know, when we look at culture, what we are seeing is the mirror of patriarchy. If we live in a patriarchal, misogynist, white supremacist world, it will be mirrored back to us through the culture. And of course, that's why for the past 30 years, people have been sending me images that show these connections. You know, a pink pig sexualized, with a come hither look and high heels and lipstick and wearing a bikini, or, you know, wearing garters and stockings, all for a barbecue ad. So that's the mirror of patriarchy and speciesism. So social media is going to do that too. And one way it does it in the vegan community is, my God, how many white men are being supported by monthly donations because they're the ones who are going to change the world? Why are we empowering more and more, you know, sort of like white lifestyle influencers? Is that the world we're looking to become? And also some of them are so opinionated too. So then that becomes another way of mirroring patriarchy. Instead of believing in, say, grassroots organizing and community organizing and working at the local level or working at the, you know, the nation level, we're going to deputize these white men to be our spokespeople. Boy, that is retrograde. It represents its own kind of nostalgia for the, you know, the perfectly coiffed or not coiffed spokesman for the movement. That's going backwards.
Yeah, that connects to, I think, a point that I've certainly seen a lot of in whether it's vegan branding, social media, you know, how products are marketed in the vegan community, particularly I think in the last sort of few years as social media's kind of really exploded. And like you say, this kind of there's also almost this sort of, you know, the white male savior kind of trope it's made its way into veganism. But I think, you know, when I look at some of that branding, it's sort of centered around some of the things that you talk about in the sexual politics of meat, around the way that kind of the male stereotype, if you like, is fed and, you know, by meat and by the flesh of animals, is kind of made its way in a sense, to me at least, into veganism. But do you see it kind of in a positive way? Because ultimately it's trying to say that, you know, masculinity is made through plants, you know, the sort of the strength and so on and all this kind of stuff? Or do you actually see it as it's just rebranding of the same old idea?
Yeah.
You know, but just being sold to vegans in a new sense?
Making veganism safe for white men. That could be the slogan. I mean, really.
Yeah, that's right.
It's still the sexual politics of meat. I mean, they could have, instead of having these slogans, real men eat plants and all that, who's a real man? Why do we have to know what a real man is? Why is masculinity something that can be pinpointed and sort of reified through plants or meat? I mean, that is the sexual politics of meat. They're just turning the idea upside down and saying, no, you're not going to get your masculinity from meat now. I mean, because meat and dairy are going to make you flabby, and they're going to make you weak, and they're going to, they're still participating in the idea of what men should be. Why aren't we just saying, look, the gender binary is falling. There is gender fluidity. There is so much movement. Why are we so hung up in keeping something masculine or feminine, male or female, if there's a plurality here? And there we could use veganism and all the different ways we can cook. There is a plurality in veganism versus a homeostasis with meat and potatoes and dairy milk and an egg for breakfast. That is just so limited. And instead of flipping that and saying, oh yeah, you can be a real man this way, why aren't we just saying, move forward with plurality? We have no idea all the different ways to prepare vegetables and fruits yet. I mean, vegan chefs are showing us all these incredible creativity. Why can't we let that creativity be working also at the level of gender and stop feeling like we have to make veganism safe for white men? I mean, really, it's a shame.
Feels like it's what marketing understands. It's a language that marketing, whether it's in business or even, I think, marketing that we've all learned when we've grown up with some social media in our lives, have learned this language of marketing and then want to perpetuate it because that's almost all we know, and haven't broken out of it. It seems to me, at least.
But also because it keeps it as the patriarchal, white-centered mirror that dominant culture is. Think outside the Instagram post. Think outside, the Twitterverse. The kind of dynamic veganism that's possible is almost being held back by the idea that we have to sort of domesticate it to make it appropriate. Probably more white men are adopting veganism because they've gone to their doctors as well. So I'm not saying we shouldn't try to get everybody to see the benefits of veganism, but we should recognize the political dynamics that are going on when we create targeted campaigns that reinforce really very sad stereotypes.
I suppose that brings me on a little bit to things like, and I can think about various kind of meat substitute kind of burgers, and how big business is using sort of, again, the similar language. There's almost like, you see meat substitutes now that are obsessed with making things look like they're bleeding, and these kind of things, which have, seems like a very bizarre concept to me. Do you think that that I suppose this monetization of veganism is kind of a concern for the movement? Again, just another sort of distraction or move back to retrograde step, if you like, back to white male centered views.
Let me answer that in just a second. My dog is at the door and can't understand why I'm not letting him in. Hold on just one second.
That's very important.
Inky, come on. so in answer,
we cannot have an unhappy dog.
That's true, and he's very happy now. He has settled in. Thanks. So I did a book called Burger, and it's in this series called Object Lessons, where each book looks at something different, say a bookshelf or whales, a whale song, or a drone, cigarette lighter, etc. So I did burger, and I looked at the history of the burger, and I redefined the burger as a single portion protein patty, which I really liked for the alliteration. And once you disassociate burger from the notion that it has to be from a dead animal, but instead that it's a single portion protein patty, I looked at sort of history of food. Where do you find these? Well, the falafel would be a single portion protein patty. Some of the Indian patties that could be traced to like 1500 BCE were that as well. And whenever the hamburger sort of makes its appearance in the United States in the late 19th century, there were veggie burger-like things nipping at its heel throughout the whole 20th century. So this new appearance of these sort of textured vegan products isn't anything new. What's new is that they may have finally found something that meat eaters don't realize isn't meat. In Living Among Meat Eaters, I say people are perfectly happy eating vegan food as long as they don't know that is what they're doing. Because they're bringing their consciousness. It's their feeling like you're depriving me of something. So I think there's a role for any food that allays that suspicion and shows meat eaters they really don't know what they're eating. And so I got married like 42 years ago, but we had these walnut balls at our wedding reception, and I remember this very boorish guy came up and he said, "So you gave in, Carol? So you gave in?" Thinking he was eating a meatball. And I just had so much fun. I never told him. I laughed. I mean, I just had to laugh at him, because we have to remember this is the level at which some meat eaters are operating. Like, you can't take away my meat, and who do you think you are? And so I've met the founders of both Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, and what I know about them is that they both were concerned about climate change, the fate of the animals and the cruelty of slaughtering, the situation of slaughterhouse workers, and all the environmental devastation and the health. I know that it was a well-rounded reason that brought about those companies. And that what they both recognize is what I just said. People don't want to give up their so-called meat, and so their intervention into public consumption is very interesting. It's the media who's really carried away with this idea of a burger that bleeds. I remember when Beyond Meat came to England, I was interviewed by a food magazine or something about it being the burger that bleeds. I said, it's not even advertised that way. I mean, you all are making it that. They do not advertise it that way. That's actually Impossible Burger, not the Beyond Burger. But the notion that you've got to have a burger that bleeds then fed into the way the media was receiving the information. Now, is there a place for those kind of burgers? Sure. This is back to the plurality of veganism. Lots of vegans, we could eat them or we could not. We know how to make our own veggie burgers. But we have to remember that neither of those companies were making them for vegans. They were making them for non-vegans. In terms of monetization of the vegan movement, we are one of the social change movements that involves consumption, literal consumption of food. things are going to be monetized. How else are we going to get those products out there? So, as long as we're living in a capitalist system, we are stuck with monetization. How that happens and whether we should believe that sort of from the top down product change is the only way to happen, rather than what I like to think about as sort of spontaneous grassroots vegan meals that so overwhelm or persuade because you're just so relaxed about it. Here, try this. This is a wonderful meal. And people can walk away and think, oh, that was a wonderful meal. And, oh, yeah, Carol's a vegan. Oh, I just ate a vegan meal. Oh, that was pretty good. So that we don't have to look at that as our only solution, because it's not. But in terms of a repertoire of responses, I think that's a fair one.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely heard or I recall there being, especially around sort of the Veganuary time, which seems like about 1 million years ago now, this January that's just gone, and there being a number of new products to hit the market, KFC in particular, and there being a fairly lively discussion in some of the social media channels that I'd followed, whether it's the sort of Twitterverse or whatever, around whether vegans should partake in it, and whether it's good to perpetuate a vegan product like that, and then therefore sort of almost buying our way into some sort of social change, or whether actually we're just going to monetize KFC even further and perpetuate their success, which is going to ultimately result in further climate change and further suffering to animals and so on and so forth. So it'd be interesting to get your perspective on that particular debate as well.
Well, I just don't think vegans need to be eating at KFC unless you're doing some cross-country ride and can't get something anywhere. I mean, again, we should not think of these as the solutions to us. If we're vegans, we've already figured it out. And, there's something that becomes even more complex. For instance, when Wendy's had a veggie burger here in the United States, and everybody said, go to Wendy's and support their veggie burger. But their employees were striking at that time. Why would you cross a picket line to support Wendy's? What we are about is powerful change, but it isn't about any one product. It's really about transformation, and we need to align ourselves with others working for the kinds of transformation we believe in, and to recognize that we can be doing harm. Veganism is not the solution to everything. I always see veganism as a beginning point. Sure, I'm a vegan, but during the day, I might be working in a domestic violence shelter, or I might, be on the front lines with Black Lives Matter, or I might be doing anything. My veganism just becomes something I take for granted as I then engage with other community needs and become a member of the community that needs change. For us to settle and think, veganism is the final thing I have to do. No. Veganism should always be pricking our consciousness that if we are empathetic and care, what are the other issues that call to us?
100%. Sort of a 3 times a day act of protest and avoidance of destruction, reminder of empathy, but like you say, one that can fuel the rest of our day's worth of activism in a whole range of different subjects, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things in The Pornography of Meat, which comes out on October 29th. So that book was originally done in 2003, and it was trying to show sort of how representations work. Sexual Politics of Meat laid out this theory, but really had very few images when it first appeared. But people started sending me images from all around the world, and I thought, oh, well, now I need to discuss this, and now I need to discuss this. The animalization of African American women, particularly in the way they're shown as animals, or how pinkness is functioning as a sort of signifier of whiteness, pink pigs and all. And so then my publisher offered to bring it out, and I said, "Gee, I'll need to look at it and bring out an updated version." And so now this version has 340 images from around the world that just show how dispersed these attitudes are, including something I call chalk misogyny. So it would be something that your local restaurant chalks on their chalkboard outside of their restaurant, which is, terrible. The examples, of course, I'm providing are all misogynistic about animals and women. And so I'm trying to decode the wallpaper of this mirror that's white supremacist and patriarchal and xenophobic. And because those issues have become more intense in the past decade and a half, it turned out there was a lot more for me to say. So in a sense, if people are wondering, well, what is my next step? I've become a vegan, but how do I figure out how to engage with the world? Well, maybe looking at a book like that helps you become a social critic and extends your consciousness to see how our attitudes towards animals are sort of threaded throughout attitudes about women and people of color, how these oppressive attitudes sort of interweave to create the cloth of oppression. That's some place to start.
Talking of places to start, I mean, what advice would you give? Because I think, I've met so many, I suppose I'm relatively one myself, only 3.5 years vegan, but I meet so many almost on a daily basis, it feels like, and maybe that's my bubble, but of people who've transitioned to veganism and are thinking about activism and thinking about how it sort of intersects with other social movements. And what would you say is a starting point, beyond, once you've started to notice, and certainly, like you say, the pornography of meat is a fantastic way to help people along that journey of sort of like, this is what is going on around you, this is how pervasive this is. What sort of would your steps to kind of activism look like? What that you would you'd almost recommend?
Well, I think the question is, how do we express solidarity? And everybody is situated differently. And one way is to look around in your community. What are the issues? What are the issues in the exact community you're in? What are the statistics on police violence, domestic violence? Where's the xenophobia? Who's fighting that? How can you be an ally? Can you bring vegan food to meetups? Can you, just start reading about your local community? I think being involved at the local level is really important, and understanding what's happening at the national level, wherever you are. That writing letters to local newspapers, people forget that people still read local newspapers if they exist in your community. Writing letters, even turning out at council meetings or whatever level of democracy is near you, figuring out how to share veganism in a non-threatening way. I mean, having recipes with you, or having these sort of spontaneous vegan meals, working with others, always understanding where the thumb of oppression is being felt locally is important. And then acting in response and in solidarity, and not believing we have all the answers. Sometimes it's a matter of sitting and listening. We might know about veganism, and we might want to just, speak up and say, "Oh, listen, why aren't you all vegan?" But there's a certain humility in being an activist too. And we need to know when it's time for us to be listening and learning. And if you find yourself feeling uncomfortable, you're probably in the right place. And that, I think, all helps make us kind of vegans for this time. we cannot ignore the politics that surrounds our veganism.
Do you, one sort of final question for you, Carol, based on your experience and since particularly the sort of 30 years that you've seen since Sexual Politics of Meat, do you sort of feel ultimately optimistic about our direction of travel? Do you feel like, as much as it's, we've been pulled backwards in the sort of the various intersecting movements, we've actually gone forwards, further than back? What's your view on that?
Well, at a personal level, the soy milk is a lot better now. Certainly there are a lot of resources to help us, to help stimulate us and help us be, really great vegans. But I don't think any of us can measure the success of what we're doing by its outcome. The minute we do that, we are so hung up on metrics and failure and all of these complex emotions based on a projection that we will prevail. I hope we prevail. And certainly there are a lot of forces that can help us prevail, but we can't take our day-to-day living and invest it in some future success that makes or breaks or defines for us our success. I think being vegan is a success, and being an engaged vegan is great, is important, and that then you just step into the kind of water of social change, and you hope that in swimming and struggling through it, we are going to end up with a transformed world. But in the meantime, we know that we're changing the world in small ways and have to have faith that as we all work on this together, we're going to have an impact. But we can't rest our sense of accomplishment on how that impact is felt or known or measured.
Thank you, Carol. I really, really, really appreciate your time. It's been wonderful chatting to you. And thank you again. The updated version of Pornography of Meat, that's available, did you say the end of October?
Correct. In both Great Britain and the United States. And I feel like it's an intervention into our current dilemmas and offers as well some hope, because it ends with artist representations of, and I believe art is always a wonderful way to intervene and represent optimism. Even when it's critical, it's optimistic, because it's saying, I can stand here and critique. So that would be the other thing I'd encourage people to do, is support local artists in resistance, especially if they're feminist, vegan, anti-white supremacists. But yeah, the book, I think, I'm sad I had to write it. I'm sad this stuff is still relevant, but it steps into the breach with I think, a helpful interpretation so that people can see the context in which our veganism is experienced.
Well, thank you so much. I'll be sure to be checking out the book, and I'll put some links in the show notes to how to head on to your website and so on, and find out a little bit more, and hopefully pick up a copy of the new book. And also, if people haven't read it, thoroughly encourage them to pick up a copy of Sexual Politics of Meat. Like you say, sadly as relevant today as it was when it first came out. But a huge thank you for all you do, Carol. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for all your great questions, Jim, and for your own role in helping us think about these issues.